What's the first thing you think of when you hear India? For many, it's cows, curry, and caste. The single word often defines how people picture India. But what if I told you your idea of caste is completely wrong? In a world where India's influence is on the rise, with India and its diaspora spreading their culture and stories across the planet, understanding caste is no longer optional. It is essential. What exactly is it? How ancient are its roots? How rigid or flexible has it really been through history? And how does it still shape the lives of over 1 billion people? Today, we're going to shatter the stereotypes and dive into one of the world's oldest, most complex social structures. By the end of this video, you'll see that caste is more than just a buzzword or a headline. It's a lens through which we understand tradition, power, and identity itself. This is the untold history of India's caste system. So what exactly is caste? Throughout history, almost every society has some form of hierarchy, whether we call it caste, class, or something else. Typically, if you were born into a certain social group or occupation, that's where you stayed for life. But caste in India is a bit more complex. Think of it in 2 layers. The first layer is called Varna, the big categories you might recognize from that iconic caste pyramid. At the top are the Brahmins, or the priests, teachers, and scholars. Next come the Kshatriyas, the rulers, warriors, and administrators. Below them are the Vaishyas, merchants and traders. Then the Shudras, peasants, artisans, and laborers. Lastly, there's a group sometimes called the untouchables, those who perform tasks like leatherwork, cleaning, and other jobs considered menial. Originally, many of these roles were just counted among the Shudras, but over time, they formed their own distinct category. Simple enough, right? But of course, that's where it gets tricky. The second layer of India's caste system is Jati, or the subcastes. These are much more numerous and specific, often tied to local communities, particular trades, and regional traditions. Some jatis don't fit neatly into any Varna category, and these jatis are arguably the most important units of caste identity, both today and in the past. For the rest of the video, when I refer to caste, I'll most likely be referring to jatis. In short, the caste system isn't just one neat hierarchy. It's a complex web of overlapping layers shaped by occupation, tradition, and centuries of migration and interaction. Let's zoom in on the migration aspect for a moment. I've covered this in detail in another video, the history of colorism in India. So if you want the full in-depth story, be sure to check that out. But briefly, the people who formed what we now call Indian weren't just one group. In fact, at least 5 different ancestral populations migrated into the subcontinent over tens of thousands of years. Arriving around 45 to 70,000 years ago, Indian hunter-gatherers formed the earliest layers of ancestry in the region. Secondly, farmers from the Zagros Mountains in Iran moved in roughly 10,000 years ago. They contributed new agricultural technologies and mixed with the locals. This mix created the Indus Valley civilization and forms the bulk genetic component of all Indians. Then trickling in around 4,000 years ago, migrants from Central Asia added another genetic and cultural layer. When these 3 prior groups combined, we start seeing the early Vedic culture of India. Finally, we have migrants from Southeast Asia and the Tibetan Plateau arriving around the same period and integrating with the local populations. All these groups blended together over millennia. Every Indian caste or jati today is a genetic mosaic of these groups, just in different ratios. Some argue that higher castes have more Central Asian DNA. While there's a slight correlation, it's not particularly strong compared to the regional differences you see across India. In northwest and north central regions, steppe ancestry tends to be higher. In the east and south, it's lower. Similar gradients across India are there with other migrating groups as well. It's important to remember that we're talking about prehistoric long-scale migrations. Groups moved in and mixed well before recorded history. And this kind of mixing isn't unique to India. Similar patterns show up all over the world. We know from archaeology and early texts is that since the dawn of Indian civilization, people across all castes have worshipped India's land, plants, animals, and local gods. In other words, all Indians and all Indian castes are indigenous. Now that we've set the stage for how these ancestral layers form the subcontinent's people, let's ask the next big question. when did the concept of caste itself truly begin? The most ancient form of caste is most likely jati. These small localized subcastes in India operate much like ethnic groups, or people who share traditions and customs. Similarly, localized and endogamous groups have existed worldwide. So again, this idea isn't unique to India. They most likely came from the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest Bronze Age civilizations, spanning much of what is today northern and western India. It's almost certain that such a vast and advanced society had multiple ethnic groups or jatis, each with its own role and status. Human societies everywhere developed clan-based identities, occupational specializations, and local hierarchies. It's safe to assume the IVC was no exception. Over time, as the IVC declined and new populations from Central Asia migrated into the subcontinent, social stratifications evolved. It's likely in this period that we begin to see the concept of Varna emerge. Jati is a horizontal aspect of caste, a bunch of ethnic groups in a side-by-side competition and cooperation. Then Varna is the vertical aspect, stacking these groups into a broad hierarchy. Varna is first mentioned in the Rig Veda's Purusha Sukta. Here's a direct verse. The Brahmin was his mouth, of both his arms was the Rajanya made. His thighs became the Vaishya. From his feet, the Shudra was produced. On the surface, it sounds like this verse sets a rigid blueprint for Indian society, but context matters. The Purusha Sukta has 16 verses, describing not just human society, but the entire cosmos. The caste-related lines just make up one verse out of the 16, illustrating the divine unity of all of creation. Other lines describe things like the moon emerging from God's mind, the sun from his eye, space from his navel, and various gods, animals, and natural phenomena coming from other parts of his body. This is a key theme we'll keep returning to, the difference between texts that describe what people observed and those that prescribe how society should be organized. The Vedas contain verses describing poets who have parents of different occupations, like a father being a healer while the mother grinds pestle. The Vedic poets describe people of different occupations living within the same family to compare the poets of the Vedas themselves to a carpenter crafting verses. Remember, India's religious and cultural landscape has always been enormously diverse. Different regions and sects debated the nature and role of caste. India's sheer size, varied geography, and lack of a unified political framework, there was no one-size-fits-all standard caste system, more so a patchwork of evolving local traditions. It's only in the later texts that we start to see more concrete ideas around caste. One big feature of India's caste system, regardless of time or space, is the role of ritual and theology around it. Each caste would have their own specific religious traditions that link them to the gods. On a macro level, ideas like reincarnation and karma would become linked to caste. The idea was that every living thing had an eternal pure soul. However, a person's current birth, whether in the higher or lower caste, was believed to be shaped by their previous actions, or karma. Good deeds led to a higher birth, bad deeds led to a lower one. This is an oversimplification, of course, but it's key to understand how a lot of society viewed the links around caste, karma, and reincarnation. Yet being at the top of the social ladder didn't always mean a life of luxury. Upper caste, particularly Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, were bound by strict disciplines and moral codes. Brahmins, for example, were expected to live modestly, sometimes even begging for alms. Ancient scriptures frequently mock greedy Brahmins who failed to live up to their ascetic ideals. The poor Brahmin archetype is a frequent feature in ancient tales. So the top of the supposed pyramid didn't necessarily enjoy free reign, at least not in a purely material sense. On the other end lies another unique aspect, the practice of untouchability. Eventually, certain groups within the Shudra Varna fell outside the main social fold, known as Chandalas. These communities engaged in tasks like dealing with corpses or did things like consuming dog meat. This caused them to be marginalized. Although ancient scriptures like the Upanishads don't explicitly mention untouchability, Chandalas gradually came to be seen as the fifth Varna, or even outside the Varna system altogether. Over time, they were called Antyajas, and thousands of years later, they became known as Dalits. This idea of ritual purity and privilege became important in many ancient Hindu texts. Take the Chandogya Upanishad, for instance. It's one of the earliest texts linking good deeds to a rebirth as a Brahmin, Kshatriya, or Vaishya, and evil deeds to a rebirth as a Chandala. As we move into later texts like the Ramayana and Mahabharata, epics that hold massive cultural influence, we encounter unsettling incidents. In the Ramayana, a lower caste figure named Shambhuka is killed for performing penance. In the Mahabharata, the tribal Eklavya is barred from formal archery training. Taken at face value, these stories seem to show a deeply oppressive system, prompting an understandable question. If lower castes were treated so poorly and formed the majority, why didn't they ever revolt? Well, that's because I'm giving you a very narrow slice of the story. This is a slice that gets all the outrage, clicks, and it's fashionable to talk about. These spicy examples grab our attention, but ancient Indian religious and philosophic traditions were more nuanced and debated than a few verses might suggest. Consider the Upanishads we talked about. There are 108 of them, each exploring diverse, often conflicting ideas. While the Chandogya Upanishad links one's deeds and rebirth to caste distinctions, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad presents a different view. It states that from a spiritual standpoint, worldly differences, including caste, are meaningless once a person attains spiritual salvation and self-realization. It also emphasizes a single divine origin for all castes, underscoring an idea of underlying unity. Even the epics themselves contain conflicting narratives. Shambhuka's killing in the Ramayana occurs because he aspires to become the king of heaven, not simply because of his caste. Elsewhere in the same text, Lord Ram welcomes figures like Guha and Shabri, who are from lower caste or tribal backgrounds. In the Mahabharata, Eklavya's exclusion is because he didn't belong to the main Kuru royal family, not because of his social standing. Eklavya was actually a royal prince as well. Yes, we do see discrimination like Karna, the son of a charioteer, facing insults due to his low birth, but we also encounter great sages like Yagnavalkya, who claim that all Varnas spring from a single divine essence, and that all divine knowledge can come from anyone, lower caste included. The Bhagavad Gita, a key philosophical text within the Mahabharata, presents a good encapsulation of this contrast. Early on the eve of battle, the warrior Arjun worries that warfare might destroy the caste system and cause chaos, but Krishna dismisses this excuse. Later, Krishna emphasizes that devotion and self-realization transcend material differences like caste and gender. This idea of spiritual redemption is a key aspect of Hinduism. So returning to the fundamental question, why didn't the lower caste revolt? We can point to three broad factors. Number one, hierarchy was universal to the ancient world. Stratification was a norm across nearly every single civilization, making India's system less of an outlier than it currently is. Secondly, ritual traditions gave caste its own sacred framework. These weren't just systems of oppression, they were cultural and religious structures that individuals often found meaningful. Sometimes these traditions included checks and balances, like Brahmins' obligation to live austerely. 3. Nuanced and redeeming philosophies coexisted alongside discrimination. Multiple texts and traditions offered pathways that challenged or transcended caste boundaries, giving hope and meaning beyond a fixed social status. It's also worth noting that other Indian religions like Buddhism and Jainism acknowledge caste as a social reality rather than openly attempting to dismantle it. While early Buddhism had verses and stories condemning intercaste marriage, proclaiming Buddhas are only to be born in high caste lineages, and revulsion towards Chandala habits, it also provided redeeming narratives for lower castes, like stories of Buddha's compassion towards Sujata, both being born in lower castes. These faiths were not social justice revolutions, as sometimes framed today, rather they navigated and interpreted the status quo in their own ways. Additionally, we also have foreign accounts of India that corroborate what we've been talking about. The Greeks compare the asceticism of Brahmins to that of Spartan discipline. The Chinese note the practice of untouchability in Buddhist cities as well, showing that caste was a reality across religious traditions in India. Both of them, though, don't particularly pay mind to the idea of caste. They don't focus on it as much as things like the prevalence of vegetarianism or the unique practices and traditions. For them, again, caste was just another hierarchical system to organize society that they saw back at home as well. This is important because we have to look at the usual caricature of caste, where Brahmins were a very small percentage of Indians, about 3% today, control the rest of the 97% by like mind control or something. And this happens over 4,000 to 5,000 years and 1.7 million square miles. This is just not possible unless all other castes are very low in intelligence, or Brahmins really do have some type of spell that they put everyone under. It's a blanket denial of agency and sheer insult for so many of India's communities. This idea of a devious micro-minority remote controlling society may sound familiar to some of my Western audience. Some may say it's a bit on the nose. Okay, sorry, I had to make that joke. I love my Jewish friends and all, but come on, it was so well set up. Either way, My family is not Brahmin or even upper caste, so you'd save your hate comments for another YouTuber. Or just post them anyways, I think it helps the algo. Anyway, the truth is that this type of complex social structure can only function with checks and balances and flexibility. Caste was never a static one-dimensional force, even in ancient times. It was constantly evolving, debated, and interpreted differently by various communities, texts, and traditions. So when exactly did caste get very rigid, and how did people react to this? Around the time of India's classical age, a range of common law codes began to emerge. These were known as the smritis, that which is remembered. They weren't written by a single author in one go. Instead, they were compiled over centuries by multiple contributors. As a result, they often contain contradictions both between different texts and even within the same text. Naturally, caste was a central theme in these smritis. Some took a more rigid stance, while others allowed for more flexibility. Still, it's important to note that these laws weren't simply enforced word for word. Local scholars and advisors would interpret them and guide rulers on their practical application. Among these texts, the most well-known and often controversial is the Manusmriti. This particular smriti includes passages that can be quite harsh and rigid about caste. At the same time, it also contains more lenient sections. You'll find punishments directed at lower castes who overstep certain prescribed roles, as well as repercussions for upper castes who fail to meet their own moral obligations. But the Manusmriti was just one amongst many. There were others, like the Yajnavalkya Smriti, the Narad Smriti, and the Parashar Smriti, each used in different regions at different times. The Manusmriti itself influenced places like Tamil Nadu's Chola Empire and even some Buddhist kingdoms in Southeast Asia. These texts acted as foundational law codes that could be adapted to local needs and contexts. Key point, these texts are prescriptive, not descriptive. They give recommendations, but that sure as hell does not mean they're being followed to the letter. Still, the appearance of these smritis doesn't fully explain the increased rigidity of caste. Many historians pinpoint a significant calcification of the system around the 6th century AD. Politically, India wasn't a single unified empire at this time. While the Gupta Empire had previously held large territories, it was relatively decentralized. It primarily relied on the Yajnavalkya Smriti, which in many interpretations was less strict about caste divisions. To understand why caste became more entrenched, we need to consider material and social conditions. When the Gupta Empire collapsed, India went through a period of de-urbanization. With frequent conflicts between smaller kingdoms, power shifted from large urban centers to more localized rural setups. Villages, being stable and less fluid than cities, encouraged fixed social structures. In these rural environments, jati, the subgroups that make up caste, became more important and sophisticated. Each jati developed its own traditions and rituals. Over centuries, strict endogamy or marrying within one's jati led to these groups becoming genetically distinct from one another. While they may look the same, sometimes the genetic distance between one jati and another in a single Indian village may be as great as that of the distance between European ethnic groups. But all Indians didn't just magically agree to start marrying each other at very high rates in the 6th century. This was actually a gradual process. Check out this graph here describing something called founder events. Founder events are when a group becomes genetically distinct from other populations around them. Usually that's due to them marrying within their group at higher rates. Each dot on this graph represents a point in time when a particular jati effectively branched off genetically, marking its own unique identity. The vertical lines indicate margins of error, but let's set those aside for now. What's striking is that most of these founder events appear only about 1,000 years ago. While this graph doesn't cover every jati in India, the large sample size does tell us about the recent birth of many, if not most, castes. Here we have to dig deeper into material conditions again. One of the most defining features of India's last millennium was the Islamic invasions. Arabs, Persians, and Turks would invade India repeatedly and devastate the land. Today, there are very few pre-Islamic temples in the northern two-thirds of the Indian subcontinent that haven't been destroyed or defaced. That's how total the devastation was. I think this type of devastation and constant attacks on urban centers reinforce this rural and feudal aspect of India. Even converts to Islam adopted jati or kept their caste after conversions. Caste was not just a Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain thing anymore. With jati becoming more rigid, we see increasingly elaborate ideas around ritual, occupation, and discrimination. Remember that concept of untouchability I mentioned? Over time, it spread beyond the so-called fifth varna of the untouchables. It also cropped up between different jatis, within the same varna, and even across varnas in various degrees. Consider this example from the 17th century, recorded by French traveler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. He noted that merchant caste buniyas, specifically a jati called troughs, refused to eat or drink in the homes of warrior caste Rajputs because Rajputs killed animals and ate meat. Now pause for a moment to digest that. Shroff buniyas, belonging to the Vaishya Varna, the third in the classic hierarchy, practice a kind of untouchability towards Rajputs, part of the higher second Kshatriya Varna. It's a perfect illustration of how caste lines could become crisscross and contradictory. Untouchability would get more extreme also, as we see in 16th century Calicut, present-day Kerala. Italian traveler Ludovico di Vartema wrote about how the low caste like the Pulayan and Vetuvan had to stay at least 50 paces away from high caste Nayars and Brahmins unless specifically summoned. They often had to trek through marshes instead of using roads, a practice noted by Portuguese diplomat Tomé Perez, who observed severe leg swelling and other ailments amongst natives who walked in marshes a lot. To add insult to injury, the Pulayans and Vetuvans had to shout out warnings when they walked, ensuring Brahmins and Nayars could avoid them entirely. This discrimination also existed within the so-called fifth Varna itself. In Maharashtra, for example, the Mahar Jati imposed various untouchability restrictions on the Mang Jati, even though both were considered of the fifth untouchable Varna, while other communities imposed their own rules on both groups, showing how deeply fragmented and localized these practices would be. Overall, untouchability and caste discrimination came in many forms. Some regions were especially strict, while others were relatively lax. It wasn't at all uniform. The result was this kind of cold peace between countless jatis, part of why the common caste pyramid doesn't really capture the day-to-day reality. Another aspect that breaks the pyramid model is the question of occupation. Remember the archetype of the ascetic priestly Brahmin. Over time, some Brahmins ventured into pursuits like farming or occasionally ruling as warriors. This wasn't the norm, but it became more accepted than you might imagine. Meanwhile, on the flip side, various Shudra groups militarized and established their own kingdoms. India may have never had a peasant revolution in a traditional sense, partly because its peasants were split by caste, but that same caste identity also created a certain strong sense of unity within certain jatis. Once these groups gained access to weapons and power, they could, and often did, seize control. Some such Shudra jatis stayed labeled as Shudras, while others adopted Kshatriya status. Take King Praloya Vema Reddy, who proudly identified as a Shudra, seeing it as a blessing to come from the divine lotus feet of Lord Vishnu. It's yet another reference to the idea that all of creation is holy, reinforcing the ongoing theme: caste was, is, and will be complex. Despite discrimination prevailing in many areas, a powerful reaction emerged: the Bhakti movement. Rooted in earlier devotional strands of Hinduism, this movement gave rise to new sects and ideas that questioned conventions around caste. It's important to highlight that these internal Hindu debates were nothing new. As we've seen in ancient scriptures, there's a long tradition of emphasizing the soul's transcendence of material differences, whether that's through devotion or bhakti, detachment, or self-realization. The idea is woven into the essence of Hindu philosophy. Many bhakti saints came from low caste backgrounds, including at times those of the fifth untouchable Varna. Figures like Tukaram, Janabai, Ravidas, Nandanar, and Jokhamela often learned from Brahmin gurus who broke with convention by recognizing the spiritual prowess of these devotees. Teachers such as Ramanuja, Ramananda, and Jnaneshwar, all from Brahmin lineages, used the path of bhakti to elevate people from all castes. In many ways, the bhakti movement fulfilled the spirit of verses sung millennia earlier. Gurus and movements stitched themselves into the subcontinental tapestry, challenging caste-based injustices from within. Before long, people of all castes were revering these so-called lower caste saints as gurus for people of all backgrounds. Even with these strides in spiritual equality, however, material barriers remained. Though lower caste individuals could become prosperous in certain trades, as the French traveler Tavernier noted when he observed wealthy untouchable tailors, their children typically could not marry outside their caste or switch professions. This lack of social mobility often prevented genuine material upliftment. Unfortunately, caste was about to become more concrete than ever. And to understand why, we have to explore the controversial role of British colonialism. As British conquest and colonization swept the subcontinent, they quickly realized they could not rule by force alone. They needed local allies. so they used the oldest trick in the book: divide and conquer. Of course, this tactic was not unique to India, but India's vast diversity, its languages, religions, and castes, provided various different ways to divvy Indians up. One of the most ingenious ways the British did was via their legal system. Firstly, the British conducted India's first ever caste and community census. This allowed the British to assign raw numbers to castes. Suddenly, everyone knew exactly how many people were in their own caste, as well as how many there were in everyone else's caste. Castes or communities that had operated in a fuzzy in-between space now found themselves pigeonholed into rigid, often arbitrary categories. In some cases, completely new castes even got invented on a whim. Secondly, now that the British had data on castes, they started to enact policies linked to castes. These laws effectively locked people into their assigned groups. A prime example is the Punjab Land Alienation Act of 1900, which created a new category called agricultural tribes. Only castes in this category could buy and sell farmland. If you didn't belong to this category, too bad, no land for you. Then there was the Criminal Tribes Act, designated entire communities as criminals by birth. While it's true some caste members were historically involved in things like banditry, not all individuals were guilty of this crime, but according to British law, they now were. In other places, the British would upend old power structures between castes, such as in Gujarat, where the British would disenfranchise the troublesome warrior Rajput castes and give their land to the less well-off Patidars, or Patels, who many of you may be familiar with. These Patels were a group of Shudra peasant castes that previously had varying fortunes, at times suffering untouchability, while other times being landlord village leaders. Now, all of a sudden, these people find themselves in a newfound dominant position. The British made caste into a legal code. A new bureaucracy was born that codified caste into a more rigid system than it had ever been before. By attaching numbers and laws to this social system, they radically transformed caste. The American journalist William T. Ellis hammers this idea home in 1907, saying, "One advantage of caste has been mentioned to me by British Army officers. If it were not for the caste system, which breaks people into irreconcilable sections, England would not be able to hold India for 6 months." Political scientist Ajay Verghese notes that even today, caste conflict remains higher in areas that were directly ruled by the British compared to those indirectly ruled by Indian princes. Now, the British did not invent caste, but they sure as hell took advantage of it and made it worse. And ultimately, can we really blame them? They came to India to conquer, colonize, and extract. And that is exactly what they did. All while Indians themselves not just watched them do it, but they helped them do it. One of the more problematic parts about caste is that for a very long time, caste prevented a consolidation of Indians, especially Hindus. But that was soon about to change. Towards the end of British colonialism, many Indians started asking some tough questions. How did we get conquered so easily? How can we reclaim our independence? A growing number of people, many exposed to Western ideas such as freedom, liberty, and equality, zeroed in on caste as both a social problem and a likely factor in India's subjugation. In the late 1800s, a new term, Dalit, was coined, from the Sanskrit word meaning broken or scattered. Reformers like Jyotirao Phule adopted it for India's so-called untouchable caste. Later, B.R. Ambedkar, himself a Dalit, would champion it nationally in his fight for the rights of India's untouchables. Ambedkar, along with other reformers such as Babu Jagjeevan Ram and M.C. Raja, launched a pan-Indian effort to eradicate untouchability. They demanded basic rights, equal access to temples, freedom from discrimination in schools, and more. This push soon garnered support from prominent independence leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Veer Savarkar. The last one is probably the most interesting, along with B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar and Savarkar, both from Maharashtra, despised caste but offered overlapping yet distinct solutions. Ambedkar, who had faced first-hand discrimination as a Dalit, focused on material rights. He believed education and legal protections were essential for Dalit progress. One of his key proposals, reservation or affirmative action in public universities and government roles, ultimately made its way into India's constitution, which he played a major role in drafting. But Ambedkar's relationship with Hinduism might be his most controversial legacy. Early on, he pushed for reform within, meeting with Hindu leaders and fighting for Dalit participation in mainstream Hinduism. Later, though, his disenfranchisement boiled over. He formally rejected Hinduism and embraced his own version of Buddhism, called Navayana, stripping away many traditional elements like the Four Noble Truths and Nirvana. It was kind of a cult. Not kind of, it was and still kind of is. Today, Ambedkar himself is regarded not as a god, but the god by some of his followers, which can lead to certain problematic scenarios we'll discuss later. On the other hand, you have Veer Savarkar, an early revolutionary and staunch Hindu nationalist. To him, caste was a handicap. He blamed India's repeated subjugation from medieval invasions to British rule on the fractured unity caused by caste divisions. In Savarkar's view, caste wasn't inherent to Hinduism at all. Indeed, if you look at India's urban areas or diaspora Hindus, you can see how some practice a form of Hinduism with little regard for caste boundaries. Both Ambedkar and Savarkar worked tirelessly to weaken or destroy caste-based divisions. Each deserves a deeper exploration, something I'll dive into in another video, but for now, just know that by the time India finally won its independence, Ambedkar's constitution stood firm on guaranteeing rights for Dalits and other marginalized groups. This set the stage for a whole new chapter in the story of India's caste system. How would it function in a free democracy and a rapidly modernizing society? The next question is, did it really change, and if so, how much? As India stood on the brink of independence, B.R. Ambedkar posed a crucial question. Would all Indians truly be free? In his discussions with another independence leader, Sardar Patel, he stressed the difference between legal equality and actual everyday equality. For Ambedkar had a proposition. It's called reservation. Reservation is essentially India's affirmative action. Ambedkar proposed a temporary 22.5% quota in public sector jobs and government education seats, 15% for Dalits and 7.5% for tribals. In his eyes, this was a way for India's marginalized communities to finally catch up. But Patel was immediately against this idea, then amongst one of the earliest affirmative action programs in the world. Patel believed that reservation would calcify caste, not erase it. While Patel was adamantly against untouchability and viewed caste as a barrier to unity, he thought India's independence should be a clean break from the evils of the past, and Indians should do everything to unite as one. However, Ambedkar would win out, pointing out that while the state may view all Indians as one, society did not. Caste discrimination was still rife across India and would continue on for the foreseeable future. However, reservation has not been temporary as originally intended. It has only grown, something that has had profound consequences on India, which we will discuss in a bit. Today, a plaque of Patel and Ambedkar in India's parliament stands as a reminder of unity and equality. But how far has India really come on those ideas? Have reservation and other caste-based policies helped or hurt? At independence, the modern Republic of India inherited the British Raj's obsession with bureaucratic caste categories. Now, instead of British officials, Indian politicians use caste for votes and influence in its democracy. While reservation has indeed helped various communities close the gap with others and attain social mobility, as Ambedkar foresaw, Patel was also correct that caste-based policies like reservation would entrench caste consciousness and inflame divisions. Even today, India is very endogamous, with some reports saying over 90% of Indians still marry within their castes. Part of this is definitely social, but we should not underplay the element of the state. I told you that Jati Varna were the two axes we need to describe caste. But now, in modern times, we have to add a third: category. Category is the official Indian government method of classifying different jatis into groups for policies such as affirmative action or even welfare-linked caste policies. Today, you have the general caste, which mostly consists of the three upper varnas and some shudras, other backwards classes, who are mostly from the shudra caste, but also include some groups on either side, scheduled castes, who are from the untouchable or Dalit communities, and lastly, scheduled tribes, who are from tribal communities. As I said prior, a lot of these are inherited categories from the British, consisting of force-fitted individual jatis in not-so-neat categories. Others, such as the OBC, were made later in India's history, albeit just as force-fitted. The other backwards classes were a ragtag group of mostly economically backwards castes that were marked by the Indian government in something called the Mandal Commission. The Mandal Commission would recommend adding reservation for these castes, pushing affirmative action limit in India from 22.5% to 50%. Yes, that is indeed a big 5-0. Now the classification would depend on individual Indian states, so some have even broken the 50% limit, sparking endless debates in Indian politics. Naturally, this fueled resentment and splintered politics. Caste-based parties mushroomed across the country, each vying for their slice of the electoral pie. But before we lay all the blame on the government's feet, let's not forget Indian society itself. Caste was, and is very relevant for modern Indians outside of the government. Let's see why. Caste serves multiple functions. Caste is a community, a sense of belonging when the times get tough. When the riots hit, it is your caste kin who will take and throw punches for you. It gives you your rituals, your traditions, your ways of worship, and so much more. Many castes have a divine origin story, or a tale where their caste bravely overcomes injustices from that caste. Caste is a polity. When election time comes, the candidate from your caste ensures your castemen will occupy government positions, be forgiven of crimes, and have a seat at the round table of power, perhaps even the throne itself. Caste is an economy. It can be a financial safety net, a business network, or a source of credit and capital. It can be the cornering of a market or government seats. Caste is all-encompassing, as real and essential as air and water for so many Indians. Remember what I said about Jati functioning like an ethnic group? Well, with that comes discrimination. Vertical oppression against Dalits still exists, showing up in tragic incidences. From funeral processions being blocked to attacks for sporting a mustache or riding a horse. Access to water sources or temples are still restricted in certain rural parts of India to Dalits. These real-life stories serve as reminders that untouchability is far from dead. Nonetheless, India really has come a long way on the caste front. Untouchability, while not extinct, has been massively reduced. Many Indians point to factors like migration, increased education, and yes, reservation and welfare policies as key reasons for this progress. As vertical discrimination shrinks, we're left with more of a horizontal contest, where various castes stand on more equal footing. To wrap up this entire conversation on caste in modern India, let's focus on that horizontal competition idea for a moment. Picture this scenario. Imagine if you were Jamaican American and got free laptops for school, or if Polish Americans automatically qualified for extra food stamps, or if Vietnamese Americans could send someone to jail just by alleging discrimination. No evidence needed. Sounds wild, right? But that's more or less what's happening in India. India has hundreds of policies geared towards benefiting individual castes. Perhaps the most feared is the SC/ST Act, which can result in imprisonment based solely on an accusation of discrimination by a member of a scheduled caste or tribe. While this law is designed to protect historically marginalized groups, it is often misused. With top-down policies linked to caste and bottom-up attachment to caste, it naturally becomes the building block of Indian democracy and politics. Every democratic contest is a zero-sum competition between caste coalitions to get into power and empower their own caste men. It is genuinely terrible for Indian democracy and development, and is one of the prime reasons India is held back today. Writer and comedian Cho Ramaswamy sums it up very well. "It is no longer a matter of righting past wrongs," he said. "The lower classes still need help, but their advocates are concerned only with power. The leaders have no interest in eliminating caste divisions. They want to keep each jati at the next one's throat to build their own constituencies. Politicians pander shamelessly to the Harijans, who form a veritable vote bank. The quotas and set-asides, I believe, should be phased out gradually, a little bit each year, but this is not likely to happen. As long as people are kept poor, illiterate, dependent on government jobs, and bound tight to their caste, they will always be used and misled by the unscrupulous." The most fervent manifestations of caste emerge through frameworks like Jatitva. This ideology asserts that India or Hinduism cannot truly be viewed as unified entities, and instead are merely a collection of competing castes. Politics then centers on safeguarding each caste's interests or supremacy, often at the expense of others. While Ambedkar thought about ways to transcend caste, Ambedkarites today believe in using caste for political leverage rather than seeking its dissolution. Meanwhile, many politicians exacerbate these tensions by advocating proportional representation, private sector reservations, and caste-based wealth redistribution, a strategy historically known to produce dire consequences, as observed in places such as Lebanon or Rwanda. Check out my video on Jatitva in the description below for more details. Now, this sounds all very doom and gloom, but the truth is that things are getting better in India when it comes to caste. Discrimination is decreasing as Indians move around, urbanize, and broaden their perspectives. Even in politics, we see more representation in marginalized castes. Sure, many people still cling to their caste identity. A younger version of me might have freaked out at that. But now I see a bigger picture. If it's mostly about cultural rituals or community traditions rather than oppression and political power grabs, maybe caste is not the end of the world. While I personally don't care about my own caste and am generally not a fan of the caste system, especially today, I have to be objective here. Ultimately, the biggest threat to India isn't caste itself, but how it is manipulated politically. If caste continues to be a source of division rather than a vestige of cultural identity, India risks unraveling. To move forward and truly leap into its enormous potential, India has to unite beyond caste and advance into a new, more beautiful future for all of its citizens. Thanks everyone, this is Akshay from The Emissary. This is probably going to be one of my longest videos yet, and probably the most detailed as well. If you want to support my work, check out Patreon, and if you want to support it even further, slide in my DMs and we could talk business a bit. Anyways, like, comment, share, subscribe. I really want to know what you guys think about this video. I know it's probably very controversial and has a lot of different perspectives, but anyways, thanks again for watching. This is Akshay from The Emissary. Have a good one.